They said the Navy was a family. They said every recruit who bled, sweated, and fought under the flag could trust those who commanded them. But that illusion cracked the moment Admiral Harker stepped off the dais, his smile polished for the cameras, and cornered Lieutenant Elara Myles under the blinding heat of the spotlight. 300 sailors stood at attention, their boots stamping against the parade ground, their voices echoing in salute, yet no one saw what his hand attempted, no one but her. And in that instant, she made a choice that would echo far beyond the walls of the naval base. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The ceremony had been meant to honor achievement. Lieutenant Myles had shattered records during the grueling training cycle, the fastest in combat navigation, the sharpest in tactical simulations, the only officer to beat the fleet captain's score in the war games. Her name was already whispered in mess halls as the rising storm of the Navy, sharp, unbreakable, and unafraid of the old ways. For weeks she had felt the weight of eyes on her, not just of admiration but of envy, suspicion, and in Admiral Harker's case, something darker. He had always been a man who mistook power for entitlement. That day, in front of the ranks, he believed no one would dare stop him. When his hand gripped her shoulder too tightly, his fingers pressing not in congratulation but possession, she froze for half a heartbeat. She felt the shift, the change from ceremony to threat, and for that one breath, silence roared louder than the marching drums. She saw his smile, that politician's grin, masking predation, and knew what he expected: compliance, silence, submission. She had seen it before, whispered among women in the service who buried their scars beneath uniforms. But Elara Myles had not risen through fire and storm to bow. Her knees shot upward with precision trained through endless hours in combat drills. The crack was audible. Admiral Harker collapsed in an explosion of agony, his scream slicing through the rigid silence of the parade ground. 300 sailors watched as their highest commanding officer crumpled, clutching the ruin of his knee. Elara stood above him, her breath steady, her eyes unflinching, the echoes of defiance shaking the foundations of the base itself. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. For a moment, no one moved. Time seemed suspended between disbelief and the collapse of order. The ranks rippled with murmurs, shock spreading like a tidal wave. Officers exchanged frozen glances. Cameras meant to broadcast naval pride flickered, capturing instead the instant of reckoning. And there, in that liminal pause, Elara realized what she had done, not just to a man, not just to an admiral, but to the entire structure of silence that had kept men like him untouchable. The aftermath began instantly. 2 officers rushed forward to steady the admiral, their voices frantic, demanding medics. Another barked at the recruits to stand still, to hold formation. Elara did not move, her boots rooted in the asphalt, her jaw set. She knew what would come: accusations of insubordination, perhaps even court-martial, but she also knew the truth. She had prevented a violation, an assault carried out in the shadow of ceremony. And unlike so many before her, she would not let it vanish into whispers. The tension broke when the admiral, sweat pouring down his face, snarled through pain, "Arrest her." His voice cracked with fury, but his power was already shattered along with his knee. No one moved at first. The hesitation was deafening. 300 sailors had seen the moment, though not all had understood it. Some had seen only a decorated admiral fall to the ground. Others, sharper-eyed, had caught the invasive shift of his hand, the wrongness that preceded her strike. The silence itself became rebellion. Finally, Commander Violin, a woman with 2 decades of service and a scar tracing her jawline, stepped forward. Her voice cut like steel. "No." The single word split the air, more dangerous than any blade. She locked eyes with Elara and gave the faintest nod, a soldier's acknowledgement of truth. In that moment, Elara was no longer alone. But the story was far from over. Naval law was not built to protect truth when it threatened the powerful. Rumors would rise, investigations would twist facts, and the machinery of reputation would grind against her. Yet Elara had chosen her battlefield well. By acting in full view of 300 personnel, she had forced the silence into the open. Every witness was now a piece of the story, every sailor a potential fracture in the wall of cover-ups. As medics hauled Admiral Harker away, his curses echoing behind them, Elara straightened her uniform. Her chest rose and fell with steady rhythm. She did not seek applause. She did not smile in triumph. She only met the gaze of her peers, daring them to deny what they had seen. The whispers were already spreading, but beneath them pulsed something deeper, a current of fear, not of her, but of the system she had just challenged. That night, when the floodlights dimmed and the parade ground emptied, Elara sat alone in her quarters. Her hands trembled, not from regret, but from the weight of inevitability. She knew what would come. They would paint her as violent, insubordinate, unstable. They would demand she apologize, retract, submit. But she had set something into motion that could not be undone. She had broken more than an admiral's knee. She had broken the illusion that silence was safety. And as the naval base settled into uneasy quiet, a storm gathered on the horizon. For Elara Myles, this was not the end of her story, it was only the beginning. The training field of Naval Command Base Ardent was as strict and unforgiving as the men who ran it. Cadets were expected to uphold order, endure humiliation, and never let emotions crack through the veneer of military composure. But Elara Kane, a lieutenant who had already built a reputation for discipline and precision, carried herself differently. She wasn't just another soldier working for recognition, she was fire wrapped in steel, and the quiet burn of her eyes made even hardened men hesitate before addressing her. The Admiral Torin Vaynar had noticed her long before the incident that would define them both. He didn't notice her because of her record, though she held the highest training scores among female officers in the fleet. No, his gaze lingered for reasons drenched in arrogance and possession. He saw her presence not as earned, but as a challenge, an object he could control. And in his world, what the Admiral wanted, he always believed he could take. It began with subtle remarks in passing. "You carry yourself too tightly, Lieutenant. You'd do well to loosen up around your superiors." At first, Elara ignored them. She had dealt with men of power before, the kind who tried to bury their insecurities beneath cruelty. But Admiral Vaynar wasn't a man easily dismissed. His reach was wide, his authority absolute. Whispers grew among the cadets. They noticed the way his eyes followed her when she entered a room. They heard the tone in his voice, too casual, too personal, for the rigid halls of the Navy. But Elara didn't flinch. She refused to give him what he wanted, fear or submission. She carried on with precision, drilling cadets, correcting their form, leading exercises that left the field echoing with exhaustion. But beneath the surface, her resolve was tightening like a drawn bow. She had lived her entire life fighting to be respected, not for her appearance, not for her silence, but for her skill and will. To be treated as less than the rank she wore was an insult she carried silently, but she knew silence couldn't last forever. The breaking point arrived on a humid evening after inspection drills. 300 cadets stood in perfect formation on the parade ground, the stars just beginning to burn in the sky. Admiral Vaynar walked the line, his boots echoing with authority. He gave sharp nods of approval, brief smirks of disapproval, and then deliberately, he stopped in front of Elara. She stood like the others, shoulders squared, chin held high, eyes fixed ahead, but Vaynar didn't move on. He circled her like a predator circling prey. His voice carried, low enough for those closest to hear, but loud enough to poison the silence. "Lieutenant Kane, discipline, precision, cold as stone. Tell me, does the stone ever crack?" A few cadets shifted uneasily. His words weren't inspection protocol. This was something else, something invasive. Elara kept her eyes fixed forward, her jaw tight. "Permission to remain silent, Admiral." Vaynar chuckled, stepping closer. Permission denied. His hand reached out, fingers grazing too close to her shoulder, too close to what uniform regulations made sacred. And then, with no shame, he leaned just near enough for those around to understand his intent. "Everyone has a breaking point, Lieutenant. I'll find yours." That moment stretched thin as glass about to shatter. For Elara, years of restraint, the quiet tolerance of disrespect, snapped all at once. Not with fear, not with hesitation, but with precise, controlled violence. Her hand shot up, clamping his wrist before it could touch her again. A sharp twist, one every cadet recognized from joint lock drills, wrenched his arm down. And before the Admiral could register shock, Elara drove her knee upward with merciless accuracy. The crack of bones snapping echoed across the parade ground like gunfire. Gasps broke formation. 300 cadets who had been statues now recoiled in disbelief. The Admiral crumpled, clutching his shattered knee, his authority reduced to screams of agony that shattered the night. Elara didn't flinch. She didn't step back. She stood tall, eyes burning with something more dangerous than rage, resolve. She had exposed him for what he was, and in front of every single soul sworn to serve. Whispers spread like wildfire among the rows of cadets. Shock gave way to something else. Respect, admiration. Fearless defiance had erupted before them, and no one would ever forget it. The Admiral had underestimated her. He had mistaken discipline for weakness, and in that single brutal moment, Elara Kane had shown him, and all of them, why she was never to be underestimated again. But she also knew what came next. Breaking him publicly meant war within the ranks. Admirals didn't fall quietly, and the Navy didn't forgive humiliation so easily. Her battle wasn't over. It had just begun. The whispers spread like wildfire through the fleet, reaching even the lowest decks where grease-stained mechanics and raw recruits shared stories during midnight shifts. Admiral Rourke's injury had not just been a personal humiliation, it had fractured the aura of untouchable authority that he wielded over the Navy. Some officers avoided speaking of it, fearful of reprisal, but others, especially the younger ranks, spoke of Talia. She had done what none of them had dared, stand up to a man who saw himself as above consequence. Yet while the enlisted men quietly applauded her, the higher echelons of command seethed. To them this wasn't simply a scandal, it was a challenge to the very structure of their authority. Admirals didn't bleed before subordinates, admirals didn't limp, admirals didn't end up wheeled away, while a woman, barely in her 30s, stood firm in the center of the hall, with 300 witnesses burned into memory. For Talia, the following days felt like a storm that hadn't yet broken. She returned to her quarters, her pulse still echoing with the rush of adrenaline from that moment. She replayed every detail in her mind, the flicker of disbelief in Rourke's eyes as his knee buckled, the audible gasp of the sailors, the silence that followed. She had not intended to make a spectacle, but when his hand closed around her wrist and his rank shielded him from hesitation, she knew she had no other option. Her instincts, trained through years of discipline, and reinforced by a lifetime of defiance against predators in power, had surged forward. But consequences always followed instinct. By the third day she was summoned. The order came through terse, almost ceremonial channels. Commander Vela, report to Tribunal Chamber 14, 0900 hours. Immediate compliance required. The tribunal chamber was carved into the spine of the carrier ship, a place of shadows and echoes. Its walls bore plaques from centuries of naval history, where honor was etched alongside the rulings of courts-martial. Talia stood at the threshold, uniform pressed, boots shining, every detail immaculate. If they sought to break her, she would not give them the satisfaction of seeing hesitation. Inside, the panel was already assembled. 4 senior officers sat in solemn judgment, their eyes heavy with expectation. But it was the figure in the center chair that tightened her chest. Fleet Marshal Draven, a man whose cold reputation rivaled the deep sea itself. His gaze did not waver as she entered, nor did his hands shift from where they rested atop the tribunal desk. Commander Vela, Draven began, his voice like steel dragged across stone. You understand the purpose of this hearing. Talia met his gaze without flinching. I do, sir. The proceedings began with clinical precision. Witnesses were called, not sailors who had seen Rourke's aggression, but officers who spoke of decorum, respect for rank, and the sanctity of the chain of command. The narrative they tried to paint was clear. Talia was reckless, insubordinate, and dangerous to the cohesion of the fleet. Her act, they implied, was an attack on the Navy itself. But the truth had a way of clawing. When the time came for her defense, Talia did not stammer, nor did she try to plead. She stood tall, her voice carrying through the chamber with a clarity that made the younger stenographers pause their typing. I did not act out of insubordination, she said. I acted to preserve my dignity and the principles this Navy claims to defend. Admiral Rourke attempted to use his rank to excuse what would have destroyed any trust between officer and subordinate. If we permit such actions, then the chain of command is already broken. It is not I who undermined the Navy, it is he. Silence followed, thick as smoke. Draven's eyes narrowed, though not with anger, more with the calculation of a man, weighing risk and consequence. Finally, he spoke. Your words are bold, Commander. But boldness often carries a price. The tribunal adjourned without a verdict that day. Instead, Talia was placed on restricted duty, her movements monitored, her future left dangling like a blade above her head. But what those officers hadn't counted on was the sailors. In hushed corners of mess halls, in the weight rooms, in the bunks where trust was traded in whispers, the story grew. Talia Vela was no longer just another officer, she was a symbol. Sailors passed her name like a torch, her act like a crack in the armor of corruption that shielded the powerful. Some even dared to say that if the Navy truly stood for honor, it needed more officers like her, not fewer. And far from the carrier, in the halls of political influence, where admirals brushed shoulders with senators, the incident rippled outward. Families of sailors wrote letters. Advocates began asking questions. Pressure mounted, not against Talia, but against Rourke. For the first time in years, his name was being spoken not with reverence, but with doubt. One evening, confined to her quarters, Talia received a message through a secure channel. The sender's identity was scrambled, but the content was sharp and deliberate. They will not forgive what you've done, but know this, you are not alone. There are others who have waited years for someone to stand as you did. Be ready, the tide is turning. Talia stared at the flickering message, her mind racing. She had thought she stood alone in defiance, but perhaps she had only lit the first flame of something larger. And somewhere, in a dimly lit recovery room, Admiral Rourke seized. His knee, shattered, had been rebuilt with surgical precision, but the humiliation remained. He would not forget what Talia had done, not before 300 sailors, not before whispers that gnawed at his authority. His vendetta was now the fracture in the chain of command had begun, but the real storm was only gathering. The silence in the mess hall did not last long. Once the Admiral had been carried out, groaning and clutching his shattered knee, the dam of noise broke open. Some shouted in shock, others cheered. Many whispered, with voices trembling, as though what they had just witnessed would be etched in their minds forever. Elara Myles stood amidst it all, her chest heaving, her fists trembling, adrenaline still pumping through her veins. She had acted on instinct, 15 years of conditioning, reflex, sound in unforgiving combat zones, and the iron refusal to let anyone strip her of dignity or control. Yet even as the officers began to murmur, she realized something more dangerous had happened. In that single violent instant, she had exposed herself. For 15 years, she had buried her power, presenting herself as nothing more than an efficient logistics officer, someone quiet and unremarkable, the kind of woman who blended into the background. But the way she moved, the precision of her strike, the speed with which she executed it, those were not the movements of someone trained in Navy basics. Those were the movements of a ghost from Black Operations, someone schooled in discipline the public never even knew existed. The youngest ensigns, their mouths hanging open, stared at her, as though she were both terrifying and awe-inspiring. One even muttered, that wasn't just luck, she knew exactly what she was doing. Elara caught the look in his eye, the kind of look soldiers once gave her on the battlefield, not of fear, but recognition, and that was dangerous. She turned, trying to leave, before anyone could purse with questions, but her commanding officer, Captain Sultran, stepped into her path. Elara, he said, his voice low but urgent. That was the Admiral. You've just... He stopped himself, glancing around at the crowd. You've just done something no one here will forget. Elara met his eyes, her jaw tight.
He tried to force himself on me. You saw. I did, Sultran admitted. And I don't blame you. But do you understand what this means? The political storm this is going to cause. Her silence was answering. She knew. The Admiral was not just any officer. He was connected, powerful, and protected by decades of military. Even broken and humiliated, he would not go down quietly. The crowd had begun to disperse, but whispers trailed behind like smoke. Some officers exchanged knowing glances. Others kept stealing looks at her, as though waiting for her to explain. She could already hear fragments of their voices. She dropped him like he was nothing. Did you see how fast she moved? That wasn't Navy training. That was something else. Elara clenched her fists at her side, her pulse hammering in her ears. She had sworn never to let this happen. She had built her life carefully, brick by brick, to keep her old self buried. And now, one brutal instant had undone it all. That night, as she walked the dim corridors back to her quarters, she felt the weight of eyes on her. Not just suspicion, curiosity, and in some admiration. But admiration could be as dangerous as suspicion. When she closed the hatch behind her, she sank onto her bunk, running a hand through her hair. She could still hear the sharp crack of bone under her stroke, still see the Admiral collapsing in pain, still feel the shock wave that had passed through the room. It wasn't regret she felt, it was inevitability. For 15 years, she had managed to stay hidden. But deep down, she had always known her past would surface eventually. You could bury a shadow, but shadows had a way of creeping back to life when the light shifted. Her comm device buzzed on the desk. A message from an unknown sender blinked on the screen. We saw what you did. We know who you are. Contact us before they do. Elara's breath caught in her throat. The words pierced through her chest like guns. Someone out there, maybe even in the very halls of this ship, recognized her for what she truly was. Not just some woman defending herself, but a ghost, a weapon, a Black Ops operative who was supposed to be long gone. Her mind raced with possibilities. Was it an ally, an enemy, someone from her past who had been waiting for her to slip? Before she could even decide, a knock rapped against her hatch. Her body tensed. Slowly, she opened it. It was Captain Sultran. His expression was grim. The Admiral is demanding your immediate court-martial, he said. But that's not all. He's also demanding a full background inquiry. Her pulse quickened. A background inquiry meant records, history, questions she couldn't answer truthfully. 15 years of carefully concealed identity would unravel in days, maybe hours. Elara kept her face calm, but her voice came out sharper than she intended. And what do you plan to do? Sultran studied her carefully. What I should do is hand you over to the inquiry board. What I will do, he hesitated, his jaw tightening. Depends on what you tell me tonight. Her eyes narrowed. Tell you what. He leaned closer, lowering his voice. Who you really are. Elara's throat tightened. She had expected the day to come, but not like this. Not under the fluorescent lights of a naval carrier. Not after an act of survival had ripped her mask away. For a long moment, she said nothing. Then finally, she straightened her shoulders, meeting his gaze. If I tell you the truth, she said, you may wish you never asked. The captain didn't flinch. Try me. And for the first time in 15 years, Elara considered speaking the words she had vowed never to utter again. The truth of what she had done, the blood she had spilled, the missions buried under black ink. Because whether she wanted it or not, the witnesses would not forget. The Admiral would not forgive, and the shadows were already closing in.
The morning of the ceremony dawned clear and cold, the kind of brittle winter light that made the ocean's surface look like hammered steel. On the naval base, everything was crisp with formality. Rows of officers in dress whites, flags catching the sharp wind, and the sound of boots in perfect unison against concrete. It was supposed to be a day of pride. Awards, promotions, commendations, the Navy's way of polishing its image, reminding its people and the press that service was not only sacrifice but also honor. But beneath the immaculate uniforms and rehearsed smiles, a storm was waiting to break. Elara stood at the far end of the parade ground, her dress uniform pressed to perfection, the weight of her medals gleaming on her chest. To the crowd she was a symbol of resilience, one of the few women who had clawed her way to this rank, earning respect through battle-tested courage and unflinching loyalty. But to her today was something else entirely. It was not a ceremony of celebration, it was a trap. The Admiral had orchestrated the entire event to spotlight himself. His plan was clear: stand in front of 300 Navy personnel, including politicians, journalists, and foreign military attachés, and humiliate her under the guise of authority. He had waited months for this. Every maneuver had been calculated, from the timing of the event to the positioning of the cameras. Elara knew it the way she knew the ocean's tides. As the brass band played the ceremonial march, she kept her eyes steady, her breath even, her hands flexing inside her white gloves. Around her, whispers drifted, her name passed between sailors, each carrying a tone of reverence or doubt. She didn't care. She was beyond the stage of caring about reputation. What mattered now was control, not his, hers. The Admiral's voice boomed across the microphone, dripping with authority and self-importance. He listed achievements, accomplishments, the Navy's proud traditions, all while his eyes scanned the audience like a predator testing the herd. When he called Elara forward, there was a flicker of smugness in his tone, as though he believed he already owned the ending to this performance. She walked toward him, every step echoing like a drumbeat in her chest. Cameras clicked, recording history in real time. Her metal clinked softly, the only fragile sound in a sea of steel. She reached the Admiral, saluted, and stood at attention. To anyone watching, it was the image of discipline. To her, it was the moment before the strike. The Admiral stepped closer than protocol demanded, too close. His hand hovered near her back as if to guide her, but his fingers brushed in a way that wasn't guiding at all. It was a silent claim. His voice dipped low, not into the microphone, but into her ear. His words poisoned disguised as authority. You should be grateful I made your career. Show me that gratitude. Every nerve in Elara's body lit like a flare. Months of whispers, veiled threats, and unwanted advances crystallized into this instant. And just like in the training fields where she had endured worse than most men could imagine, she remembered the rule that had kept her alive. Pain could be endured, humiliation could be swallowed, but one thing must never be allowed: control taken from you. In one swift motion she pivoted, her heel planted against the concrete, her body rotating with the precision of combat. Her knee snapped upward with brutal force, striking his leg. A crack rang out, sharp as gunfire. The Admiral collapsed, his scream tearing across the silence of the parade ground. Cameras captured everything: the revered Admiral writhing on the ground, clutching his shattered knee, his authority crumbling in front of hundreds of witnesses. Gasps erupted. Soldiers froze mid-salute. Journalists leaned forward like sharks tasting blood in the water. The entire ceremony dissolved into chaos. Elara stood tall, her chest heaving, her eyes hard as iron. She didn't cower. She didn't retreat. She stepped forward to the microphone, her voice ringing clear, carried by the cold wind. No man, no matter his rank, has the right to lay claim to another. The Navy stands for discipline, for honor, not for abuse. Her words sliced through the stunned silence. Officers shifted, some ashamed, others wide-eyed with dawning respect. The Admiral's screams became background noise to her declaration, and in that moment, the entire narrative of the ceremony flipped. This was no longer his stage, it was hers. Security rushed forward, not toward her, but toward him. Protocol demanded medical attention. She didn't move, her stance as steady as the steel ships docked in the harbor. The Admiral had tried to turn her into a spectacle of submission. Instead, he had become the spectacle of disgrace. But Elara knew this wasn't over. Breaking his knee had broken his facade, but power was not just bones and muscle. It was influence, connections, strings pulled behind closed doors. The real battle wouldn't be on the parade ground, under the gaze of cameras. It would happen in the shadows, where admirals whispered into senators' ears, and dossiers were rewritten with a pen dipped in venom. As she stood beneath the harsh winter sun, medals gleaming, the taste of rebellion still sharp in her mouth, she understood something. This fight had just escalated beyond her body, beyond her dignity. It was now a war for truth inside a machine designed to bury it, and she wasn't backing down. The infirmary smelled of antiseptic and steel, sharp and cold like the atmosphere that clung to the base after the Admiral's collapse. Nyla sat on the narrow cot, her knuckles still raw, her breathing shallow but steady. She knew the storm had only begun. The shattering of Admiral Carrington's knee had been loud, decisive, impossible to erase. 300 personnel had seen it, 300 witnesses had heard the crunch of bone and the scream that followed, and now, every one of them would be pulled into the undertow of silence, loyalty, and fear. The door creaked open, and Commander Holt entered, his cap tucked under his arm, his face grave. He shut the door behind him, as though cutting her off from the rest of the world. His eyes locked onto hers, steady, piercing, unreadable. "You realize what you've done," he said, not as a question but as a fact. Nyla straightened her posture, refusing to shrink beneath the weight of his tone. "Yes, sir," I stopped him. Holt sighed and set his cap on the metal table. His hand lingered there, fingers tapping, the silence stretching between them. Finally he spoke, softer this time. "Do you know how many careers could be burned to ash, because of this? Yours, mine, everyone who even breathes near this file." She clenched her jaw. "And how many more would he have destroyed if no one stopped him? How many women before me stayed silent because they were afraid?" The commander studied her, his lips tightening, as if he wanted to argue, but found no ground. He paced once, twice and then leaned against the wall with a low exhale. "The Navy isn't a place for stories like this, Reyes. They bury them, they rewrite them until no one remembers. The Admiral will not let this define him, he'll turn it back on you." Nyla held his gaze. "Then let him try. He can spin the story, threaten my career, call me insubordinate. But the truth is carved into the silence of those 300 who saw him fall. They know what happened, even if they never speak it." Holt studied her for a long moment, then nodded once, sharply. "I'll protect you where I can. But you must be ready. This won't stay in the shadows for long." 2 days later, Nyla walked across the base parade ground, under the weight of hundreds of eyes. The sun burned overhead, but the air was colder than it should have been. Conversations halted when she passed. A mechanic froze mid-wrench. A medic stopped tying a bandage. Soldiers lowered their voices, whispers carried like smoke. She had become a symbol overnight, one that divided the ranks. Some saluted her with subtle nods, admiration hidden in the curve of their lips. Others looked away, muttering, bitter, convinced she had humiliated not just the Admiral, but the institution itself. And in the Admiral's absence, silence reigned. His quarters were locked down, guarded. He had been flown off base for surgery, but his shadow remained heavy over every hallway, every meal, every drill. By nightfall, Nyla found herself summoned. The summons came on heavy cardstock, stamped with the emblem of the Navy, delivered by a young ensign who couldn't meet her eyes. "Lieutenant Nyla Reyes, you are hereby ordered to appear before the Board of Inquiry, regarding the incident on the 14th. Attendance is mandatory." Her pulse quickened, though her expression stayed calm. She had expected this, but the speed of it unsettled her. She folded the paper and slipped it into her jacket. The battle wasn't over, it had only just begun. The chamber where the board convened was suffocating. Wood-paneled walls, a row of stern officers, and the relentless sound of her boots clicking against the floor as she walked in. Nyla stood tall in her uniform, every button shining, every crease sharp. She refused to let them see her tremble. Rear Admiral Kingston, the chair of the inquiry, adjusted his glasses and cleared his throat. "Lieutenant Reyes, you understand why you're here?" "Yes, sir," Nyla replied evenly. "Good," Kingston said, folding his hands. "The Admiral claims you attacked him unprovoked during an inspection. His injuries are severe. The burden is on you to explain your actions." A ripple of murmurs moved through the room. Nyla didn't flinch. "With respect, sir, that's not what happened. Admiral Carrington attempted to force himself on me. His injury was the result of my defense." The room stilled. Some officers shifted uncomfortably. Others stared at her with hawk-like intensity. It was clear this wasn't the narrative they wanted spoken aloud. Kingston's gaze hardened. "Lieutenant, do you understand the weight of such an accusation?" "I do, sir, and I stand by it." A younger captain on the board leaned forward. Do you have evidence, witnesses? Nyla's voice rang steady. 300 personnel were present. They saw him corner me. They saw what followed. They may be afraid to say it, but they know. Her words struck the air like steel against stone. For a long moment the chamber was silent. Kingston exchanged glances with the others, their faces masks of calculation. Then he leaned forward, his tone clipped. We will investigate further. But understand this, Lieutenant, truth in the Navy doesn't always survive politics. Consider carefully the ground you're choosing to fight on. Nyla saluted crisply. With respect, sir, it's not the ground I chose. It's the ground he forced me onto, and I won't back down. That night, Nyla returned to her quarters to find a note slipped under her door. It was unsigned, written in hurried block letters. They're already rewriting the story. Watch your back. Her hand tightened around the paper. She folded it carefully, tucking it into the pocket of her uniform. She had walked into this knowing it would be dangerous. But the truth was a weapon, and she wasn't about to let it be taken from her hands. The silence of 300 personnel was her shield, even if fear tried to keep it locked. The Admiral thought she had ended his reign of power by shattering his knee. But Nyla knew this was only the beginning of the war. The military courtroom was nothing like the civilian trials Amara had seen on TV. It wasn't built for justice, it was built for power. Long oak tables stretched under cold fluorescent lights, portraits of long-dead admirals, staring down from the walls as though daring anyone to challenge the Navy's authority. Amara sat at the defense table, her crisp uniform buttoned high, her back impossibly straight. Every muscle in her body felt tense, every nerve ready to snap, but she refused to let it show. She had been trained to withstand storms. This was just another kind of battlefield. Across from her sat Admiral Rourke, the man whose knee she had shattered in front of 300 witnesses. His leg was still wrapped in a brace, but the arrogance on his face was untouched. He smirked at her like a man confident the system would bend in his favor. And why wouldn't he? Men like him had built this system, brick by brick, rule by rule, each designed to protect those at the top. His lawyers, 3 of them, all dressed in immaculate black, leaned in, whispering strategy. Every so often, Rourke chuckled, shaking his head, as if the entire trial was a nuisance, a formality. As if Amara's pain was nothing more than an inconvenience. The presiding officer, a stern rear admiral named Casson, entered with slow, deliberate steps, his metals clinking faintly with each movement. He banged the gavel once, and the room stiffened into silence. The trial had begun. Amara's attorney, Commander Hayes, a wiry man with piercing eyes, leaned toward her. "Remember," he whispered, "they'll try to paint you as unstable, insubordinate, and violent. They'll claim you lashed out without provocation. Don't let it shake you. Your strength isn't just in what you did, it's in why you did it." She gave the smallest of nods, her hands folded neatly in her lap. But inside, her chest burned. She wasn't afraid of Rourke, she was afraid of the silence. That the truth might be swallowed whole, as it so often was in halls like this. The prosecution wasted no time. They painted Rourke as a decorated leader, a man with decades of service, someone who had guided countless sailors into greatness. They called him a pillar of discipline, a mentor to many, a cornerstone of naval tradition. They emphasized his injury, the way he had been humiliated before his men, claiming Amara had assaulted him out of defiance, a reckless act that could not be tolerated in the Navy's ranks. At one point, Rourke removed his brace, exposing the swollen knee. He grimaced dramatically, milking every sympathetic glance. "I only tried to correct her," he said, his voice dripping with self-righteousness, "to remind her of respect, of decorum. Instead she attacked me, in front of the entire unit. If such insubordination goes unpunished, then what kind of Navy do we have left?" Every word was poison. Amara's stomach tightened, but she didn't look away. She wanted him to see her eyes, steady, unbroken. When it was her turn, Hayes rose. His voice was calm, firm. "Respect to Admiral Rourke is not demanded, it is earned. And what my client endured was not correction, it was coercion. We will prove, beyond doubt, that Amara did not strike first. She defended herself, not just from an unwanted advance,
but from an abuse of power that has gone unchecked for far too long. Witnesses were called, sailors who had been in the auditorium the day it happened. Some spoke honestly, recalling the Admiral's hand grabbing Amara's wrist, his body leaning far too close. One swore he heard her say, "Let go," before the fracture of bone echoed across the room. Others, men who had risen under Rourke's mentorship, parroted his narrative, claiming they had seen Amara snap, that she had overreacted, that no real danger had been present. The contradictions hung in the air like smoke, truth and lies tangled together, choking everyone who listened. Amara was finally called to testify. She rose slowly, her heart pounding so hard, she could feel it in her fingertips. Taking the oath, she looked directly at the panel of officers. She could see some skeptical, some curious, and one an older woman captain, watching her with a quiet, guarded sympathy. Amara inhaled, steadying her voice. "On that day, I stood where every sailor stands, in service, in loyalty, in the belief that my body, my dignity, and my honor would be protected by the institution I swore to serve. But that is not what happened. Admiral Rourke tried to take something from me, something he thought his rank entitled him to. I stopped him, because no one else would. I will not apologize for defending myself, and I would do it again." The room was silent. Even the officers who had looked doubtful, now shifted in their seats, discomfort flickering across their faces. But the prosecution pounced. "So you admit," the prosecutor pressed, "to striking your superior officer in front of 300 pearls?" Amara's didn't blink. "I admit to defending myself. Rank does not give license to assault. Discipline is not a shield for abuse." A murmur rippled through the gallery. The prosecutor scowled, adjusting his papers. He tried again, this time with venom. "Petty officer, do you realize what you've done to this institution? To the reputation of the Navy? One act of violence like yours casts doubt over all of us. You've endangered the trust that keeps this entire body together." Amara's hands clenched the edge of the table, but her voice was steel. "With respect, sir, the trust was endangered the moment leaders like him believed they could take whatever they wanted, without consequence." That night, after the session ended, Amara sat alone in her barracks, staring at the ceiling. The day's words replayed over and over in her head, sharp as broken glass. She didn't know which way the judgment would swing. She didn't know if the truth would be enough. But as exhaustion dragged her toward sleep, she realized something. Win or lose, guilty or cleared, she had spoken. She had broken the silence, and that in itself was a kind of victory. Because for every sailor who had endured what she endured, her words had carved a crack in the wall of fear. And cracks, she knew, could spread. The trial wasn't over, the verdict was still days away. But the tide had shifted. Even Rourke, for the first time, looked less certain. His smirk had faltered, his arrogance thinned. He had underestimated her before. He was doing it again. And Amara was prepared to prove him wrong, one final time.
The naval courtroom wasn't built for justice. It was built for intimidation. The heavy oak doors groaned shut behind her as she entered, the sound echoing like the toll of a bell before an execution. Rows of officers filled the chamber, their crisp uniforms pressed so sharply that the fabric itself seemed like armor. All eyes turned to her. Not one pair softened. They wanted her to see it that she stood alone. At the center, elevated like a throne, sat the tribunal of 3 admirals. Their ribbons gleamed in the low light, their faces carved into stone masks that betrayed nothing. And yet when the presiding admiral leaned forward, his lips twitched in the faintest curl of disdain. She felt it instantly. This wasn't a trial. It was a performance. They wanted a spectacle. The room buzzed with suppressed whispers, the kind that slice sharper than any blade. She struck an admiral. She'll be dishonorably discharged. She'll disappear. She didn't flinch. Instead, she squared her shoulders, letting silence settle around her like armor. Every step she took toward the defense table felt heavier, as though the air thickened with hostility. But she would not let them see her falter. The prosecutor wasted no time. "Your Honors, this case is simple," he declared, voice booming, rehearsed. "The accused," he spat the word like venom, committed an act of gross insubordination and violence against a superior officer. In front of 300 witnesses. This is not rumor. This is fact. The courtroom erupted with nods, murmurs. He let them boil before continuing. She claims provocation. She claims justification. But the Navy does not operate on excuses. It operates on discipline, on hierarchy, on order. If we allow this behavior to go unpunished, what precedent do we set? The words were crafted to wound her before she even spoke. And from the glances exchanged among the tribunal, they struck their target. But then the prosecutor leaned in with a cruel smile. She may hide behind claims of morality, but in reality she's nothing more than a soldier who forgot her place. That was their weapon. Not truth. Not evidence, but hierarchy. Her defense attorney rose, a younger lieutenant commander whose nervous fingers betrayed his inexperience. He argued weakly about context, about her spotless record, about the need to hear her side. But no one leaned in. No one cared. It was her turn. When she stood, the weight of 300 unseen witnesses, those who had been in that hangar, those who whispered now behind closed doors, seemed to press against her. Her voice cut through the air like a blade. Yes, I struck the Admiral. The room froze. Gasps rippled across the chamber like a wave. She didn't deny it. She didn't soften it. She leaned forward, eyes locked on the tribunal. But I did not strike him because of rank. I struck him because he crossed a line no rank, no title, no medal gives anyone the right to cross. The silence was deafening. I was cornered, harassed, touched without consent. And when I defended myself, you call it insubordination. You call it disgrace. Tell me, her voice sharpened, rising, what is the disgrace? A man abusing his power, or a woman refusing to bow to it? The tribunal shifted uncomfortably, their masks cracking for the briefest of moments. The prosecutor barked, speculation. There is no proof. She snapped back, there were 300 witnesses. Do you mean to tell me that 300 officers saw nothing? Or do you mean to say they are too afraid to speak? A hush swept the room. The truth dangled in the air like a live wire, dangerous, undeniable. Her hands trembled slightly at her sides, but her gaze never wavered. Silence does not equal innocence. She continued, her voice steadier now, powered by the storm in her chest. Silence equals complicity. If the Navy demands silence in the face of abuse, then it demands loyalty not to justice, but to corruption. Her words struck deeper than she imagined. A few officers shifted in their seats, glancing at one another, whispers beginning to ripple. The tribunal banged the gavel, demanding order. But she had already planted the seed. They could punish her, they could discharge her, they could bury her record, her reputation, her career. But they could not erase what had just been spoken into existence. As the session adjourned, she was escorted out, but her chin was high. For the first time the fear had shifted. It wasn't hers. It belonged to them, because they knew, whispers had begun. And whispers once freed were impossible to contain. The weeks following the Admiral's fall from grace felt like living inside a storm. Reporters swarmed the gates of the base, their microphones like bayonets aimed at anyone wearing uniform. The Navy, an institution that prided itself on discipline and silence, was now cracked open for the world to see. And Mara stood at the center of the rupture. Inside the barracks, whispers chased her everywhere she went. Some sailors saluted her in quiet respect, calling her the woman who stood tall. Others muttered slurs under their breath, poisoned by loyalty to the Admiral, refusing to believe their idol had crumbled. But Mara had little time to dwell on division. She was called into debrief after debrief, forced to retell her story, until the words felt like shards grinding against her teeth. And yet, each time she spoke, her voice didn't waver. She knew that cracks in her story would be weaponized, twisted into inconsistencies. The truth, however, was unshakable. She had defended herself when no one else had dared intervene. Her fists had shattered not just cartilage and bone, but the culture of silence that had rotted the institution for years. Still, the storm wasn't finished. The Admiral's legal team launched an aggressive counter-offensive. They painted him as a decorated war hero, undone by a moment of misunderstanding. They tried to smear Mara as an over-ambitious sailor, who had provoked him, twisting her strength into arrogance. The courtroom became a battlefield. On one side Mara, armed with truth and courage. On the other, the Admiral shielded by decades of medals, connections and influence. The first day of trial was suffocating. Mara walked into the chamber wearing her dress whites, every ribbon polished, every crease sharp. Her lawyer whispered, "Remember, you are the Navy at its best, not him." The Admiral limped in moments later, cane tapping against the tile like a metronome of defiance. He sneered at Mara as though nothing had been lost, as though his limp was a badge of sacrifice, rather than humiliation. The prosecution laid out their case, eyewitness testimony from over 300 personnel, medical reports, proving the Admiral's injuries, and Mara's own unwavering account. But the defense was ruthless. They attacked her character, questioned her competence, accused her of seeking fame. At one point, the Admiral's lawyer asked, "Isn't it true, petty officer, that you have always been unyielding toward authority? That you enjoy confrontation?" Mara stared straight into his eyes, and answered, "I enjoy survival, sir, and I enjoy justice." Her words cut the room in half. Even the judge shifted, as though struck by the weight of truth. Outside the courtroom, protests swelled. Veterans, activists, and ordinary citizens marched with signs, "Justice for Mara, no more silence." Heroes don't harm their own, but there were also counter-protests, smaller but loud, demanding loyalty to the Admiral. The nation was divided, watching with bated breath. Mara's nights were restless. She often woke drenched in sweat, hearing echoes of that night in the mess hall, the Admiral's sneer, the drunken laughter of the crowd, the snapping crunch of his knee. She wondered if the Navy truly wanted justice, or if it wanted her silence. Yet every time doubt clawed at her, she remembered the faces of the younger sailors. The women and men who had stood in corners too afraid to act, their fear trained into them by years of hierarchy. For them Mara could not falter. The trial stretched on, dragging weeks into months. The Admiral's supporters argued that a career decorated with valor should outweigh a single accusation. But Mara's side reminded the world that valor is not a shield against accountability. Finally, it was time for closing statements. Mara's lawyer rose, voice steady. "This case is not about medals or hierarchy. It is about power, misused and unchecked. It is about a sailor who stood her ground, not just for herself, but for every voice that had been silenced before her. To rule against her would not only betray justice, it would betray the very oath every officer swears to uphold." The Admiral's lawyer countered with pomp and nostalgia, framing him as a legend, a victim of exaggeration. But his words felt brittle, compared to the weight of truth. The jury withdrew. Hours stretched like years. When they returned, the air was so heavy, it felt like the entire Navy held its breath. The foreman rose. "On the charge of abuse of authority, guilty. On the charge of attempted assault, guilty. On the charge of conduct unbecoming of an officer, guilty." The Admiral's cane clattered to the floor, as though even it refused to stand for him. Mara exhaled, but it wasn't relief, it was release. The storm had not passed, but the tide had turned. The Navy had chosen truth over tradition. As she left the courtroom, cameras flashed like lightning. Reporters shouted her name, begged for statements. But Mara didn't speak. Her silence was louder than anything she could have said. Because for the first time in years, silence belonged to her. Not to fear, not to oppression. To her. And in that silence, the tide of an entire institution began to shift. The Navy had seen scandals before. Commanders misusing their authority. Whispers of abuse swept under carpets of bureaucracy. But never before had the humiliation of an admiral unfolded so publicly, so violently, and in front of the very personnel he claimed to command. And never before had the accused been the one standing taller than the accuser. The shockwaves spread like fire through dry brush. Every fleet carrier, every coastal base, every whispering mess hall, where sailors traded rumors like contraband. They all repeated the same story, an admiral who tried to take what was not his, and a woman, young but unbreakable, who shattered his knee before the eyes of 300 witnesses. For the Navy it was a nightmare. For her, it was just the beginning. The military tribunal convened faster than anyone expected. Normally, these things dragged on for months, evidence buried, testimonies rewritten, the system grinding down anyone foolish enough to challenge its hierarchy. But this time, there were too many witnesses, too many voices rising in unison. 300 personnel couldn't all be silenced, not when some had already leaked fragments of the incident to journalists hungry for blood. The woman, once a junior officer, whose name had meant nothing beyond a roster line, was now infamous. Some called her reckless, others called her brave, but none denied that she had forced the Navy to look at itself in the mirror, and the reflection was ugly. The hearing room was a box of tension, brass uniforms lined the benches, cameras were banned, but whispers ensured that nothing would stay hidden. The Admiral, still recovering, walking with crutches, tried to carry himself with dignity, but the sight of him, weakened, wounded, and no longer towering with the false confidence of rank, was almost poetic. The junior officer entered the chamber. No entourage, no protection, just her. Her uniform pressed sharp, her gaze unflinching. The silence when she entered was heavier than the steel hull of a ship. The prosecutor opened with authority. He laid out the charges: abuse of power, attempted assault, conduct unbecoming of an officer. Every word landed like a hammer strike. But then came the Admiral's defense. His lawyers painted her as unstable, impulsive, a danger to the order of command. They called her reaction excessive. They called her unfit for service, and they questioned whether her version of events should outweigh decades of his decorated career. That was when the witnesses began. One by one, sailors stepped forward, at first hesitant, then braver, voices rising like a tide. I saw what he did. He cornered her. She resisted. She warned him. And when he wouldn't stop, she fought back. Some spoke of how his reputation had long been whispered about, how young officers avoided his quarters, how silence had been the only armor they had. Now that silence was broken. The Admiral's face darkened with every testimony, not because of shame, but because of fury. His empire of control was collapsing, and he could not command his way out of it. Every voice chipped away at the shield he thought his rank would always give him. And through it all she sat still, hands folded, eyes forward, a soldier who had endured enough to know that patience was stronger than anger. When her turn came, the room shifted. No one dared breathe. She rose, stood in the center, and spoke not like a victim, but like a commander, addressing her troops. He tried to take from me what was not his to take. He thought rank would silence me. He thought fear would control me. He was wrong. Her voice did not waver. Her words did not bend. This isn't just about me. It's about every officer who thought they had no choice but to endure. It's about every voice that was silenced in the name of discipline. I will not be silenced. Not today. Not ever. The silence that followed was not empty. It was electric. The judges recessed. Deliberations took hours. But by then the verdict was no longer in question. The Admiral was found guilty, not of every charge. Systems rarely grant full justice, but enough to end his career, enough to strip him of command, enough to ensure his name would be remembered, not as a leader, but as a disgrace. When the gavel struck, the room released its collective breath. It was over. But for her it was not. The tribunal might have closed its books. The Navy might have moved on. But she knew the truth. Systems don't change with one verdict. Men like him existed in shadows, waiting, watching, calculating. She had shattered one knee, but the spine of the culture that protected him was still intact. And so as she walked out of the chamber, head held high, uniform catching the light, she knew something undeniable. This was not the end of her fight. It was only the beginning. When the footage of the Admiral's shattered knee went viral across military forums, whispers turned into roars. It wasn't just about a woman defending herself. It was about what she represented. 15 years of shadows had sculpted her into something larger than life, and now the world had caught a glimpse. Young recruits replayed the clip in secret dorm rooms, their laughter covering the awe in their eyes. Veterans who'd seen too much war messaged one another late at night. Did you see her control? Her timing? That wasn't chance. That was training. But the people who watched most carefully were the ones in power, and they didn't like what they saw. Behind closed doors, in Pentagon halls and Navy think tanks, she was reclassified, not as a problem, but as a threat. The woman who was supposed to fade quietly into civilian life now stood at the center of a storm. And yet, as the world speculated, she felt something she hadn't in 15 years. Freedom. Because for the first time she didn't have to pretend anymore. She didn't have to shrink into shadows or bite her tongue when injustice walked the halls. Her secret, that precision, that black ops past she'd buried, had been forced into the light. And instead of chains it gave her wings. But freedom came with a price. Reporters camped outside her small apartment, hungry for a statement. Shadowy men followed her at night, measuring her patterns, looking for weaknesses. Even the Navy sent liaisons knocking on her door, smiling too much, asking too little, taking mental notes with every glance. She knew surveillance when she saw it, and she smiled, because they'd forgotten something. For 15 years, she'd watched them first. Every street, every corridor, every weapon they carried at their side. While they tracked her, she mapped them. Her attacker thought he had humiliated her. Instead, he had triggered an awakening. And somewhere in that quiet storm of whispers and fear, something new was born. A movement. It began with one letter. A young sailor she had never met, stationed halfway across the world, sent her a message. I saw what you did. Thank you. They said we had to accept things, that if we resisted our careers were over. You proved that wasn't true. You proved we aren't powerless. Her chest tightened as she read the words, because she remembered being that young. She remembered what it felt like to think you had no choice. And she vowed right then, he would not be the only one. She answered. Her inbox flooded, stories of harassment buried under ranks, silent abuse covered in medals, soldiers, sailors and officers who fought wars abroad while fighting nightmares at home. Each one was a spark, and she was the fire waiting to consume the lies. Her Black Ops past had taught her many things: infiltration, surveillance, execution. But its greatest lesson was this: one strike in the right place could collapse an empire. And she knew exactly where to hit next. The tide had begun to turn, and Mara could feel it in the subtle shifts around her. She walked through the base early one morning, her boots echoing against polished floors, every eye on her, yet no one daring to speak. Whispers traveled faster than orders. Some sailors muttered about the courage of the woman who had struck down an admiral. Others muttered with fear thick in their voices, about what it meant for the hierarchy they had sworn to obey. And somewhere in the quiet corners of the mess halls and barracks, stories that had never been told began to emerge. Women who had been silenced for years approached her cautiously, their voices trembling, as they shared experiences that had once felt too dangerous to admit. A corporal recounted a senior officer who had exploited her trust. A petty officer whispered about harassment so subtle it had been nearly invisible to anyone who hadn't experienced it. Mara listened. Each story added weight to the invisible ledger she carried in her mind. Every account was another brick in the foundation of a movement that was beginning to take shape. A movement built on courage, strategy and survival. She didn't speak much, but when she did, her words were deliberate, sharp and precise. Silence is no longer an option, she told a small group of recruits huddled in the shadows of a storage bay. They want obedience, but they cannot demand fear. They want loyalty, but it cannot be bought through intimidation. You have rights, you have power, and when you stand together their control falters. Her message spread like wildfire. She began receiving messages in coded formats, notes tucked under doors, texts that disappeared after being read, encrypted emails from sailors who had never dared speak. You are not alone. We are ready to act. We've been waiting for someone like you. The Navy's old guard did not take this lightly. Threats arrived in muted forms: transfers to distant outposts, whispers of disciplinary action, and veiled warnings from officers who remembered her past in Black Ops and feared the reckoning it could bring. Mara anticipated every move.
Her experience had taught her to see beyond the surface, to predict behavior before it became action. She did not need to strike blindly, she simply needed to show strength, to be the anchor in a storm where fear had always been the only constant. As days turned into weeks, the movement solidified. A clandestine network of junior officers and enlisted personnel began organizing quietly. They exchanged tips, protected one another, and ensured that no one would face abuse alone. They learned to move like shadows within the Navy itself, present, yet unseen until the moment of action. Mara watched from the periphery, letting the network grow without overt interference, only intervening when the threat of exposure or retaliation became imminent. She had learned long ago that power is most potent when it is invisible until it strikes. By the time the tribunal convened again to review the Admiral's conduct formally, the movement was ready. Her allies had positioned themselves strategically across the base, ready to testify, document, and protect one another. The Navy had underestimated her, underestimated what one person could do when trained to survive against impossible odds. And in that underestimation lay the seeds of its undoing. Mara's story was no longer her own. It had become the story of every voice that had been silenced, every hand that had been held back, every life that had been pressured into submission. The spark she had ignited in Part 11 had become a flame, and now it was spreading beyond her control, exactly as it should. The base was tense in a way Mara had never felt before. It wasn't the quiet tension of a drill, nor the taut nerves of an operation in enemy territory. It was the tension of a system beginning to fracture from within. Whispers of defiance had grown into conversations shouted across corridors. Orders were questioned openly, and officers who had once demanded obedience found themselves facing silent resistance at every turn. Mara moved through the base with measured steps, observing how her presence had shifted everything. She could see it in the eyes of those who had once looked down on her, in the hesitant glances of those who had been complicit, and in the determined nods of those who had quietly aligned with her. The tribunal was set for a public hearing. It was unusual, unprecedented. The Navy could no longer hide behind secrecy. The world was watching, and the stories she had collected demanded justice. When the session began, Mara entered with quiet authority. All was packed. Officers, sailors, journalists, and spectators alike, all waiting for the confrontation that had been building for months. The Admiral sat at the front, cane in hand, his pride battered almost as severely as his knee. He glared at Mara, a mixture of disbelief and fury flashing across his face. Alwa's eyes, however, were steady. She did not need to intimidate. She only needed to speak the truth. One by one, witnesses came forward. Junior officers who had been silent for years described harassment, coercion, and abuse. Sailors recounted the culture of fear that had protected the Admiral and others like him for decades. Each testimony was corroborated by documents, recordings, and the meticulous records Mara had maintained since the day she first struck back. By the time she took the stand, the weight of countless voices pressed against her shoulders. But instead of bending under it, she carried it with pride. "I did not act alone," she began. "I have not acted alone. For 15 years you have hidden behind medals, behind silence, behind the idea that fear is obedience. I have trained, I have survived, and I have watched. And now so have others. We are not alone. We are not silent. We are not afraid." Her words resonated through the chamber. Some officers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, realizing that the era of unquestioned authority was ending. The Admiral, once a symbol of invincibility, flinched as the gravity of the moment settled around him. This was not just a personal reckoning, it was a systemic one. When the gavel fell, it was not merely a sentence against a man, it was a declaration that abuse, secrecy, and fear would no longer be tolerated. Mara had done more than defend herself. She had dismantled the illusion that power could exist without accountability. As she walked out of the tribunal, she was met with quiet applause, nods of respect, and the first real smiles from those who had once cowered in fear. The Navy would never be the same. Her past, hidden for 15 years, had become a catalyst for change. and as she stepped into the sunlight, she felt the weight of the silence she had carried finally lift. It was gone, replaced by the hum of a movement that she had helped ignite, a movement that promised that no one would ever have to fight alone again. For the first time Mara allowed herself a smile. She had survived, she had fought, and she had transformed an era. The past that had been hidden, the skills that had been honed in darkness, and the courage that had been tempered in fire. All of it had led to this moment, and in that moment she was not just a survivor. She was a symbol, a force, a reminder that even in the deepest shadows, power can be reclaimed, and that when the final strike lands, it doesn't just end one battle, it ends an entire reign of fear. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.